What if I told you that the story of Job contains shocking secrets that most people never discover? Behind this tale of suffering lies a cosmic battle that will completely change how you see God's plan for your life. Job wasn't just a man who lost everything. He was chosen for something far greater than anyone imagined. In the next few minutes, you'll uncover hidden truths about divine testing, Satan's limitations, and why God allows good people to suffer. The revelations in Job's story will transform your understanding of faith, purpose, and God's ultimate victory. Get ready to discover mysteries that have been hidden in plain sight for thousands of years. This isn't just ancient history, it's your story too. In the ancient land of Uz lived a man whose name would echo through history. Job was not just wealthy, he was the richest man in all the East. The first chapter of Job tells us exactly what he owned. Job chapter 1 verse 3 lists his incredible possessions. His possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. These weren't small numbers. This was wealth beyond imagination. The sheep alone would have made him rich, but Job had thousands of them, their white wool covering the hills like clouds. His camels were like trucks in the ancient world, carrying goods across deserts and making him money from trade routes that stretched from Arabia to Egypt. The oxen plowed his fields, producing grain that fed his enormous household and left plenty to sell in distant markets. But Job's true treasure wasn't his animals or gold. Job chapter 1 verse 1 describes him perfectly. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. This wasn't just someone trying to be good. Job had achieved something rare in human history. He was completely honest in all his dealings, never cheating a customer or lying to a business partner. Job chapter 1 verse 2 tells us about his family. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 10 children, a complete and blessed family. Every morning he would offer sacrifices for his children. Job chapter 1 verse 5 explains his daily routine. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. Job lived in perfect balance, incredibly blessed materially, yet completely devoted to God spiritually. His reputation spread far and wide across the ancient world. People traveled from distant lands just to hear his wisdom and see his prosperity. Kings sought his counsel, and merchants wanted to learn his business secrets. But what impressed people most wasn't his wealth, it was his character. In a world full of corruption and greed, Job stood out like a bright light. He proved that it was possible to be both successful and godly, both rich and righteous. His life was a testimony that serving God didn't mean living in poverty. Job's daily routine was a perfect blend of business wisdom and spiritual devotion. He understood that wealth was a responsibility, not just a privilege, and he used his resources to help others and honor God. His workers were treated with dignity and fairness, receiving wages that allowed them to support their families well. When travelers needed shelter, Job's house was always open. When the poor needed food, Job's storehouses were never empty. What happened next takes us into a realm most people never imagine. Job chapter 1 verse 6 opens a window into heaven itself. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Picture this scene, a divine council meeting where heavenly beings gather before God's throne. These aren't casual meetings like friends getting together for coffee. This is the court of the universe, where decisions are made that affect everything on earth. The throne room of God is more magnificent than any palace ever built. Angels and heavenly beings stand in perfect order, each one radiating the glory of their Creator. Among them walks Satan, not as some equal power, but as one who must report to the Almighty. This wasn't a chance encounter or a surprise visit. This was a scheduled meeting, and Satan had to show up just like everyone else. He couldn't skip it, send an excuse, or pretend he was busy elsewhere. The conversation that follows will change everything for Job, though he has no idea what's happening in heaven. God speaks first, asking Satan where he's been. It's not that God doesn't know. He knows everything that happens in heaven and on earth. But he's making Satan give an account of his activities, forcing him to report like an employee reporting to his boss. Job chapter 1 verse 7 records Satan's answer. Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." He's been roaming, searching, looking for opportunities to destroy and deceive. Like a prowling lion, he's been hunting for someone to destroy. But he's not hunting randomly. He's looking for the best targets, the people whose fall would cause the most damage to God's kingdom. This heavenly counsel shows us something amazing. Even Satan must answer to God. He's not free to do whatever he wants. He operates under strict limits, and he has to report back on everything he does. Every temptation, every attack, every scheme must be approved by the one who sits on the throne. This scene reveals the cosmic order that governs all spiritual warfare. Satan may roam the earth looking for victims, but he cannot act without divine permission. This truth should bring comfort to every believer. No trial comes without God's knowledge and approval. Then God does something that seems almost like bragging. Job chapter 1 verse 8 records his words, "And the Lord said to Satan, Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" God is showing off Job like a proud father, showing pictures of his best child. He's not just mentioning Job casually, he's highlighting him as the perfect example of faith and righteousness. Out of all the people on earth, God chooses Job as his star witness. This is the highest praise imaginable, God himself calling someone perfect. But Satan's response cuts deep. Job chapter 1 verses 9 and 10 record his brutal comeback. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land." Satan's accusation is brutal and simple. Job only loves God because God pays him well. He's suggesting that Job's faith is fake, that it's just a business deal. According to Satan, God has built a protective wall around Job, keeping all trouble away from him. Every business deal succeeds. Every harvest is perfect. Every investment pays off. The weather is always good for his crops. His animals never get sick. His enemies never attack him. Then Satan delivers his challenge in Job chapter 1 verse 11. "But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." Remove the blessings, Satan argues, and Job will curse God to his face. This challenge strikes at the heart of all faith. Is our love for God real, or do we just love what he gives us? Satan is betting that Job's faith is nothing more than a business transaction. He's claiming that no one really loves God for who he is. They only love him for what he provides. Strip away the health, wealth, and happiness, and people will show their true colors. Satan believes he understands human nature better than God does. He thinks he's found the flaw in God's plan, that all human love is conditional and selfish. What happens next is shocking. Instead of defending Job or dismissing Satan's challenge, God does something unthinkable. Job chapter 1 verse 12 records his response. "And the Lord said to Satan, Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. God gives Satan permission to destroy everything Job owns. But notice the limit. Satan cannot touch Job's body. This isn't God being cruel or uncaring. This is God being so confident in Job's faith that he's willing to let Satan prove himself wrong. God knows something about Job that even Job doesn't know yet. The test isn't about whether Job will survive, it's about revealing the depth of faith that already exists in his heart. God is essentially saying, go ahead, take everything he has. You'll see that his love for me isn't based on what I give him. This permission comes with strict boundaries. Satan can attack Job's possessions, but he cannot kill Job or even hurt his body. These limits show us that God is still completely in control. Satan thinks he's getting a free pass to destroy Job, but he's actually being used to prove God's point. The permission comes with rules, restrictions, and boundaries that Satan cannot cross. God is like a parent letting their child learn a lesson, but still protecting them from real harm. Satan leaves this meeting with permission to unleash disaster, but he's walking into a trap he doesn't even see. He's about to discover that true faith can't be bought or sold. What Satan doesn't understand is that God's confidence in Job isn't based on hope or wishful thinking. It's based on knowledge. God knows Job's heart better than Job knows it himself. He knows that Job's faith goes deeper than his circumstances, that his love for God is real and unshakable. This test will prove to everyone, including Job himself, what God already knows. The attack begins immediately. Job chapter 1 verse 13 sets the scene. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. It's a normal family gathering, a celebration. Job has no idea what's coming. He's probably at home, maybe reviewing his business or spending time in prayer. The sun is shining, the birds are singing, and life seems perfect. Then the messengers start arriving, one after another, each bringing worse news than the last. Job chapter 1 verse 14 records the first messenger's report. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them. The scene starts peacefully. His animals are working in the fields as usual, but then disaster strikes. The messenger continues in the same verse. And the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them and struck the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Raiders have attacked his farm, stealing hundreds of oxen and donkeys. But worse than the theft is the murder. His servants, men who worked for him and trusted him to protect them, have been killed in cold blood. These weren't just employees. They were part of Job's extended family. He knew their names, their families, their dreams. Now they're dead, and their blood stains the ground. Only one survived to bring the terrible news, and he's probably wounded and traumatized. Before Job can even process this loss, before he can send help or comfort the families of the dead, the second messenger arrives. Job chapter 1 verse 16 brings more horror. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Lightning strikes, killing thousands of sheep and more servants. The smell of burned flesh fills the air. The fire is so intense that it completely consumes everything, animals, people, and equipment. Job chapter 1 verse 17 records the third messenger's arrival. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. More raiders, more theft, more murder. In minutes, Job's vast wealth is gone, and many of his people are dead. These weren't just animals to Job. They represented years of hard work, careful planning, and God's blessing on his efforts. But Satan isn't finished. The worst news comes last. Just as the third messenger finishes speaking, a fourth arrives, with news that will shatter Job's world completely. Job chapter 1, verses 18 and 19, deliver the final blow. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house. And it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. A tornado, sudden and violent, has collapsed the house where all 10 of Job's children were celebrating. In one moment, Job's entire family is wiped out. These weren't just children. They were adults with their own lives, their own families, their own dreams. Job had watched them grow up, had been proud of their success, had offered sacrifices for them every day, according to Job chapter 1, verse 5. The oldest son who owned the house, the beautiful daughters, the successful younger sons, all crushed under falling stones and timber. Job's legacy, his future, his reason for working so hard, all destroyed in an instant. The man who had everything now has nothing. His wealth is gone, his servants are dead, and his children are buried under rubble. This is Satan's masterpiece of destruction, total devastation delivered in a single day. The timing is perfect and cruel. While Job was losing his possessions, his children were enjoying life, completely unaware that death was coming for them. They were laughing, sharing stories, enjoying each other's company. Maybe they were talking about their father, grateful for all he had done for them. Then the wind came, and everything ended. The house that had been filled with joy and laughter became a tomb. The timing isn't coincidental. Satan orchestrated everything to happen at once, to overwhelm Job with grief and loss. He wants Job to feel completely alone and abandoned, to believe that even God has turned against him. What happens next defies all human logic. Any normal person would collapse, would scream, would demand answers from God. Most people would rage against heaven or fall into despair. Some would blame God, others would blame themselves. But Job does something that shocks even heaven itself. Job chapter 1 verse 20 describes his actions. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. He tears his clothes and shaves his head, signs of deep grief in his culture. These aren't empty gestures. They show that Job feels the full weight of his loss. He's not pretending everything is fine or trying to be stoic. He's devastated, broken, overwhelmed by sorrow. But then he falls down and worships, not complains, not questions, not demands, worships. Job chapter 1 verse 21 records his incredible words. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." These aren't the words of someone in shock or denial. This is a man who understands something profound about God's nature. He recognizes that everything he had was a gift from God in the first place. He came into the world with nothing, and he'll leave with nothing. Everything in between was grace. He doesn't blame God or question his goodness. Instead, he blesses God's name in the middle of his worst nightmare. This response is so unexpected, so contrary to human nature, that it proves God's point completely. Job's faith isn't based on his circumstances. It's based on his knowledge of God's character. He doesn't understand why this happened, but he knows that God is still good. He doesn't see how this could be part of God's plan, but he trusts that it is. Job chapter 1 verse 22 confirms what Satan never expected. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. The first test is over, and Satan has lost completely. Job has proven that true faith can withstand any trial, that love for God can survive any loss. This isn't just a victory for Job, it's a victory for everyone who has ever wondered if their faith is real. But Satan isn't ready to give up. Another day comes when the heavenly council meets again, and Satan shows up with excuses. Job chapter 2 verses 1 and 2 set the scene. Again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, And Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." The conversation starts the same way, but this time God has something to celebrate. Job chapter 2 verse 3 records God's victorious declaration. And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." God is declaring victory. Job passed the test. Even after losing everything, Job maintained his faith and his integrity. God is essentially saying, "I told you so. You were wrong about Job and I was right." But Satan has one more card to play. Job chapter 2 verse 4 records his darker argument. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin, all that a man has, he will give for his life." Satan is claiming that Job's response was selfish. He's saying that Job only stayed faithful because his own body wasn't touched. It's easy to lose possessions and even children, Satan argues, but when your own life is threatened, when your own body is in pain, then you see what someone is really made of. Job chapter 2 verse 5 contains Satan's final challenge. "But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." People will sacrifice anything to save their own lives, Satan argues. They'll deny God, abandon their principles, and betray their closest friends if it means avoiding physical suffering. Touch his body with pain and disease, and he'll curse God. Satan believes that when people face physical suffering, their true nature comes out. He's seen it happen countless times. People who seemed strong and faithful crumbling when faced with illness, pain, or the threat of death. Job chapter 2 verse 6 records God's permission for round 2. And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life." God sets another limit. Satan can cause Job physical pain, but he cannot kill him. The stage is set for an even more brutal test. Satan thinks he's finally found Job's breaking point, but he's about to learn that true faith goes deeper than physical comfort. The enemy's strategy reveals his fundamental misunderstanding of genuine believers. He assumes that everyone has a price, that sufficient pressure will break anyone's faith. But Job's upcoming response will prove that some things cannot be bought, sold, or broken through suffering. Satan wasted no time in unleashing his second attack. Job chapter 2 verse 7 describes the horror that followed God's permission. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. The disease was immediate and total. Every inch of Job's body erupted in painful sores that burned like fire and itched beyond endurance. These weren't ordinary skin problems. They were deep, infected wounds that oozed constantly and filled the air with a terrible smell. The pain was so intense that Job couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly, and couldn't find any position that brought relief. His once strong body, which had carried him through years of successful business, was now a source of constant agony. The boils covered his scalp, making it impossible to rest his head. They spread across his face, distorting his features until friends might not recognize him. His hands and feet were so swollen and painful that he couldn't walk normally or use his hands for simple tasks. Job chapter 2 verse 8 tells us about his desperate attempts to find relief. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. He had to scrape the infected sores constantly to drain the pus and try to ease the burning sensation. The pottery shards cut into his flesh, but even that pain was preferable to the constant burning of the boils. Job sat in ashes, the ancient way of showing deep mourning and humiliation. The ashes stuck to his open wounds, creating a paste of dirt, blood, and infection. His appearance was so shocking that people would cross the street to avoid looking at him. The man who once wore fine clothes and commanded respect now sat like a beggar covered in his own filth. Satan had succeeded in reducing the greatest man in the East to a pitiful figure that inspired more disgust than sympathy. Every breath brought fresh waves of pain. Every movement reopened wounds that had started to heal. This wasn't just physical suffering. It was a systematic destruction of Job's dignity and humanity. In the midst of Job's physical agony came an attack from the person who should have been his greatest comfort. Job's wife, who had also lost everything. Her children, her wealth, her comfortable life, watched her husband suffering with growing bitterness. Job chapter 2 verse 9 records her devastating words. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." Her suggestion was both simple and terrible. Give up on God and end the misery. She had watched Job, scraping his wounds, heard his groans of pain through sleepless nights, and seen him reduced to a shadow of his former self. In her mind, if this was how God treated his most faithful servants, then faith was pointless. Her advice revealed the depth of her own despair and anger. She wasn't just suggesting that Job curse God. She was telling him to commit the ultimate act of rebellion and then face the consequences. In her broken state, death seemed preferable to continuing this nightmare. But Job's response in Job chapter verse 10 showed that his faith remained unshaken. But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Job called her foolish, not because he didn't understand her pain, but because her logic was flawed. He reminded her that they had received many good things from God over the years: their children, their wealth, their health, their happiness. If they could accept good things from God's hand, shouldn't they also be willing to accept difficult things? Job's response showed his deep understanding of God's sovereignty. He didn't see their suffering as evidence that God had abandoned them, but as part of a larger plan that he couldn't understand. Even in his darkest moment, with his body racked with pain and his wife urging him to give up, Job refused to blame God or abandon his faith. His wife's words revealed how suffering can drive even good people to desperation, but Job's response proved that true faith can survive even when hope seems lost. News of Job's catastrophic losses and terrible illness spread quickly throughout the region. 3 of his closest friends heard about his condition and decided to travel to see him. Job chapter 2 verse 11 introduces these men. Now, when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. These weren't casual acquaintances. They were successful men from distant cities who left their own important business to be with their suffering friend. Eliphaz came from Teman, a place known for wisdom. Bildad traveled from the land of the Shuhite, descendants of Abraham. Zophar made the journey from Naamah. The fact that they coordinated their visit shows how much they cared about Job and how seriously they took his situation. But when they arrived, they got the shock of their lives. Job chapter 2 verse 12 describes their horrified reaction. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. The man sitting in the ashes was so disfigured by disease that his closest friends couldn't identify him at first glance. When they realized it was actually Job, they were so overwhelmed with grief that they began the ancient rituals of mourning. They tore their expensive robes the same way people did when someone died. They threw dust on their heads, showing their shock and sorrow. Their loud weeping echoed across the area, expressing the pain they felt at seeing their friend reduced to such a state. Then something remarkable happened. Job chapter 2 verse 13 records their decision. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. For a full week, these 3 successful, important men sat in silence with their suffering friend. They didn't try to fix the situation or offer quick solutions. They simply showed up and stayed, sharing his pain through their presence. This silent vigil was actually the most helpful thing they could have done. Sometimes the best comfort comes, not from words, but from simply being there with someone in their darkest hour. After 7 days of silence, the dam finally burst. All the pain, grief, and confusion that Job had been holding inside came pouring out in one of the most emotional speeches in all of Scripture. Job chapter 3 verse 1 marks the moment. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. What followed was not a curse against God, but a passionate wish that he had never been born at all. Job chapter 3 verses 2 and 3 record his opening words. And Job said, "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it." Job wished he could erase his birthday from the calendar, make it disappear completely, so that he never would have existed. He wanted that day to be swallowed up in darkness, forgotten by God, and hidden from the light. Job chapter 3 verses 11 and 12 reveal the depth of his despair. Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb? Why did the knees receive me? Or why the breasts that I should nurse? He wondered why his mother's knees had been there to receive him when he was born. Why her breasts had been ready to nurse him. If he had died as a baby, he reasoned, he would have been spared all this agony. Job chapter 3 verses 13 and 14 show his longing for the peace of death. "For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept. Then I would have been at rest with kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves." In death, he imagined, there would be no pain, no grief, no endless questions about why good people suffer. Rich and poor, kings and slaves, all rest equally in the grave. Job chapter 3 verses 25 and 26 capture his feeling of helplessness. "For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes." Everything he had always feared, losing his family, his health, his wealth, had actually happened. He felt like trouble was his constant companion, giving him no peace. This wasn't the calm, controlled Job who had blessed God's name after losing everything. This was a man pushed to his absolute limit, crying out in raw, honest pain. Yet even in his deepest despair, Job didn't curse God or abandon his faith. He cursed the day of his birth, but not the God who gave him life. Job's emotional outburst broke the 7-day silence, and his friend Eliphaz felt compelled to respond. But instead of offering comfort, Eliphaz launched into a speech that would begin 3 rounds of painful debates. Job chapter 4 verse 1 introduces his response. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, Eliphaz started gently enough, acknowledging Job's previous role as a counselor to others. Job chapter 4 verses 3 and 4 record his opening words. Behold, you have instructed many, and you have strengthened the weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling, and you have made firm the feeble knees. He reminded Job of all the people he had helped in the past, all the good advice he had given to others in their times of trouble. But then Eliphaz delivered a painful accusation. Job chapter 4 verse 5 contains his criticism, but now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. He suggested that Job was being hypocritical, quick to help others, but unable to handle his own problems. Then Eliphaz revealed his fundamental belief about why Job was suffering. Job chapter 4 verses 7 and 8 contain his theology. Remember, who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plough iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. According to Eliphaz, innocent people don't suffer like this. In his experience, only people who plant seeds of sin harvest crops of trouble. He was essentially accusing Job of hidden wickedness that had finally caught up with him. Eliphaz claimed to have received this wisdom through divine revelation. Job chapter 4 verses 12 and 13 describe his supposed vision. Now a word was brought to me stealthily. My ear received the whisper of it, amid thoughts from visions of the night when deep sleep falls on men. He described a mysterious nighttime encounter where a spirit revealed truth to him about human nature and divine justice. Job chapter 4, verses 17 and 18 record the Spirit's message. Can mortal man be in the right before God? Can a man be pure before his Maker? Even in his servants he puts no trust, and his angels he charges with error. The Spirit supposedly told Eliphaz that no human being is truly righteous before God, that even angels aren't perfect in God's sight. Therefore, Eliphaz concluded, Job's suffering must be punishment for sin. Job chapter 5 verse 8 contains Eliphaz's advice. As for me, I would seek God, and to God would I commit my cause. He suggested that Job should stop complaining and start repenting, seeking God's forgiveness for whatever sins had caused this disaster. Eliphaz meant well, but his simplistic theology was about to cause Job even more pain. What followed Eliphaz's speech was a series of increasingly intense debates that would stretch across many chapters. Job responded to Eliphaz's accusations with pain and frustration, defending his integrity while expressing his confusion about God's treatment of him. Job chapter 6 verse 2 captures his emotional state. Oh, that my vexation were weighed, and all my calamity laid in the balances. He wished his friends could somehow measure the weight of his grief and understand the magnitude of his suffering. Job chapter 6 verse 4 reveals his feeling of being under divine attack. For the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. Job felt like God was shooting poisoned arrows at him. That divine terror was his constant companion. This wasn't the language of someone who felt guilty. It was the cry of someone who felt betrayed by the God he had served faithfully. Bildad then joined the debate, offering his own version of the same basic theology. Job chapter 8 verses 3 and 4 contain his harsh words. Does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children sinned against him, he delivered them into the hand of their transgression. Bildad actually suggested that Job's children had deserved to die because of their sins, a cruel accusation that must have felt like salt in Job's wounds. Zophar added his voice to the chorus of accusers. Job chapter 11 verses 6 and 7 show his arrogant assumption, and that he would tell you the secrets of wisdom, for he is manifold in understanding. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. Can you find out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limit of the Almighty? And Zophar claimed that Job was actually getting off easy, that he deserved even worse punishment than he was receiving. The three friends took turns attacking Job's character and defending their theology. They repeated the same basic arguments. Good people are blessed, bad people suffer. Therefore, Job's suffering proved he was bad, but Job refused to accept their logic. Job chapter 13 verses 15 and 16 reveal his determination. Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Yet I will argue my ways to his face. This will be my salvation, that the godless shall not come before him. Even if God killed him, Job declared, he would maintain his innocence and argue his case directly with the Almighty. He knew he wasn't perfect, but he also knew he hadn't committed the kind of terrible sins that would warrant such extreme punishment. The debates grew more heated with each round, with the friends becoming more accusatory and Job becoming more defensive. Just when it seemed the debates had reached a stalemate, a new voice entered the conversation. Job chapter 32, verse 2, introduces this unexpected participant. Then Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite of the family of Ram, burned with anger. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God. Elihu was much younger than the other four men, and he had been listening to their entire debate with growing frustration. His anger had two targets: Job for seeming to claim he was more righteous than God, and the three friends for failing to answer Job's arguments effectively. Job chapter 32 verse 3 explains his frustration with the friends. He burned with anger, also at Job's three friends, because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. The older men had accused Job of sin, but couldn't prove their accusations or answer his questions about divine justice. Elihu had remained silent during the debates because of his youth. Job chapter 32 verses 6 and 7 explain his previous restraint. And Elihu the son of Barachel the Buzite answered and said, I am young in years, and you are aged. Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. I said, let days speak, and many years teach wisdom. He had shown proper respect for his elders by waiting for them to finish their arguments. But their failure to solve the problem finally pushed him to speak. Job chapter 32 verses 8 and 9 reveal his conviction. But it is the spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand. It is not the old who are wise, nor the aged who understand what is right. Elihu argued that wisdom comes from God's Spirit, not from age or experience. Sometimes younger people can see things that older people miss. Elihu offered a different perspective on Job's suffering. Job chapter 33 verses 19 and 20 contain his alternative explanation. Man is also rebuked with pain on his bed and with continual strife in his bones, so that his life loathes bread and his appetite the choicest. Food. According to Elihu, God sometimes uses suffering not as punishment for past sins, but as education to prevent future ones. Job chapter 33 verse 30 explains God's purpose: to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may be lighted with the light of life. Suffering, in Elihu's view, could be God's way of getting someone's attention and drawing them closer to himself. Job chapter 36 verse 15 summarizes this theology. He delivers the afflicted by their affliction and opens their ear by adversity. This was a fresh perspective that none of the other speakers had offered. The idea that God might have educational rather than punitive purposes for allowing suffering. Throughout all the debates, Job repeatedly expressed his deepest longing for someone who could bridge the gap between himself and God. He felt overwhelmed by the thought of facing the Almighty directly, yet desperate to make his case before the divine court. Job chapter 9 verses 32 and 33 capture his dilemma. For he is not a man as I am, that I might answer him, that we should come to trial together. There is no arbiter between us who might lay his hand on us both. Job recognized the vast difference between himself and God. One was human, the other divine, and there seemed to be no way to bridge that gap. He longed for an arbiter, someone who could represent both sides and facilitate a fair hearing. Job chapter 16 verses 19 and 20 show his hope for a heavenly advocate. Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and he who testifies for me is on high. My friends scorn me, my eye pours out tears to God. While his earthly friends accused him, Job believed there must be someone in heaven who knew the truth about his character and could testify on his behalf. This witness would understand both his integrity and his pain. Job chapter 19 verses 25 and 26 contain one of his most famous declarations. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. Even in his darkest hour, Job expressed faith that someone would eventually vindicate him, a Redeemer who would stand on earth and ensure that justice was done. He believed that even if he died from his illness, he would somehow see God and receive the vindication he longed for. Job chapter 23 verse 3 reveals his frustration with God's silence. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come, even to his seat. Job wanted desperately to present his case directly to God, to explain his side of the story and receive an answer to his questions. But God seemed hidden, unreachable, silent in the face of Job's anguish. Job chapter 31 verses 35 and 37 show his willingness to face divine judgment. Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it on me as a crown. Job was so confident in his integrity that he actually signed his name to his defense and challenged God to respond with specific charges. He would wear God's accusations like a crown, confident that examination would prove his innocence. Throughout all his speeches, Job maintained his innocence while acknowledging God's absolute power and sovereignty, creating a tension that would only be resolved when God himself finally spoke. After chapters of human debate and divine silence, everything suddenly changed. The moment Job and his friends had been waiting for finally arrived, but not in the way anyone expected. Job chapter 38 verse 1 marks this turning point. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, God didn't appear in gentle whispers or peaceful visions. He came in the raw power of a storm. The whirlwind was visible from miles away, a massive column of spinning air and debris that announced the presence of the Almighty. This wasn't a calm discussion between equals. This was the creator of the universe making his entrance. The wind howled with supernatural force, drowning out all other sounds and demanding absolute attention. Job and his friends fell silent as the storm approached, their previous arguments suddenly seeming trivial and insignificant. The air crackled with divine energy, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. This was the same God who had spoken worlds into existence, who had divided the seas and set the stars in their courses. His voice carried the authority of absolute power and infinite wisdom. The whirlwind wasn't just a dramatic entrance, it was a reminder of who was really in control. All the human reasoning and theological debates of the previous chapters were about to be put in their proper perspective. Job had demanded an audience with God, had signed his name to his defense, and challenged the Almighty to respond. Now his challenge was being accepted, but the terms of the encounter would be set by God, not by Job. The whirlwind announced that this wasn't going to be a trial where Job was the prosecutor. It was going to be a divine interrogation where God asked the questions and Job provided the answers. The storm's power reminded everyone present that they were dealing with forces beyond human comprehension or control. As the whirlwind settled around them, Job realized that he was about to get exactly what he had asked for: a direct encounter with the God he had served, questioned, and challenged. But the reality of standing in the presence of infinite power was far more overwhelming than he had ever imagined. The silence of God was over, and his voice was about to shake not just the earth, but the very foundations of human understanding about suffering, justice, and divine sovereignty. God's first words set the tone for everything that followed. Job chapter 38 verse 2 contains his opening challenge. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? God wasn't starting with comfort or explanation. He was pointing out that human wisdom, even at its best, was inadequate to understand divine purposes. Then came the fundamental question that would define the entire encounter. Job chapter 38 verse 3 records God's demand. Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. God was essentially saying, you want to debate with me? Fine, but I'll ask the questions and you provide the answers. What followed was an overwhelming series of questions about the natural world that demonstrated the vast gap between human knowledge and divine wisdom. Job chapter 38 verse 4 began the interrogation. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Job had challenged God's justice, but God pointed out that Job hadn't even been present when the earth was created. How could someone who didn't understand the basics of creation presume to understand the mysteries of divine justice? Job chapter 38 verses 5 and 6 continued the challenge. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? God asked about the precise engineering that went into creating the earth, measurements, foundations, and structures that were far beyond human comprehension. Job chapter 38 verse 7 revealed something beautiful about creation. When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. The creation of the earth was accompanied by celestial music and angelic celebration, events that Job had never witnessed. Job chapter 38 verses 8 and 9 moved to questions about the sea, or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb, when I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band. God described the ocean like a baby being, born and then wrapped in clouds and darkness, poetic imagery that revealed the care and intentionality behind creation. Job chapter 38 verses 12 and 13 asked about daily phenomena. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? Even something as routine as sunrise was beyond Job's control or full understanding. Job chapter 38 verses 16 and 17 probed deeper mysteries. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? God asked about the unexplored depths of the ocean and the mysteries of death itself, realms completely beyond human experience. The barrage of questions continued through multiple chapters, covering everything from weather patterns to animal behavior, from the movements of stars to the habits of wild creatures. Each question highlighted another area where Job's knowledge was limited and God's wisdom was infinite. Finally, God paused and waited for Job's response. The effect of the divine interrogation was exactly what God intended. It had completely humbled the man who had been demanding answers from heaven. Job chapter 40 verses 3 and 4 record his first response. Then Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. Job's transformation was complete and immediate. The man who had been eloquently defending his case for chapters suddenly found himself speechless. He realized that he was of small account, insignificant compared to the God who controlled all of creation. The phrase about laying his hand on his mouth was a gesture of silence, acknowledging that he had no right to continue arguing with the Almighty. Job chapter 40 verse 5 showed his recognition of his limitations. I have spoken once and I will not answer, twice, but I will proceed no further. He admitted that he had already said too much and promised to stop making demands or accusations against God. This wasn't the response of someone who had been defeated in an argument. It was the response of someone who had suddenly understood the true nature of his situation. Job had been like a child, challenging a brilliant scientist to explain quantum physics, then realizing he didn't even understand basic mathematics. The questions about creation had revealed not God's cruelty or injustice, but Job's profound lack of perspective. He had been judging God's actions based on his limited human understanding, not recognizing that divine wisdom operates on a completely different level. Job's silence wasn't sullen defeat. It was the humble recognition that he had been speaking about things far beyond his comprehension. He had demanded that God explain himself, but now he realized that he wouldn't be able to understand such explanations, even if they were given. The creature was finally recognizing his proper relationship to the Creator. Job's hand over his mouth symbolized his new understanding that sometimes the wisest response is humble silence rather than continued argument. He had learned the first great lesson of the divine encounter, that human beings, no matter how righteous or intelligent, are still finite creatures dealing with an infinite God. But God wasn't finished with his lesson. Job's humility was appropriate, but there was still more for him to learn. Job chapter 40 verse 6 announces the continuation. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said. God's second speech would focus on two mysterious creatures that demonstrated his power over the most fearsome forces in creation. First came the introduction to these lessons. Job chapter 40 verses 7 and 8 repeated the earlier challenge, but with a new focus. Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? God pointed out that Job had been essentially putting God on trial, declaring him wrong in order to maintain his own righteousness. Then God introduced the first creature. Job chapter 40 verse 15 begins the description. Behold, behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behemoth was a massive land animal, possibly a hippopotamus or some ancient creature now extinct. Job chapter 40 verse 16 describes its incredible strength. Behold, his strength in his loins and his power in the muscles of his belly. This wasn't just a large animal. It was a demonstration of raw, concentrated power. Job chapter 40 verses 17 and 18 continue the amazing description. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like bars of iron. The creature was built like a living fortress, with bones like metal and muscles like cables. Job chapter 40 verse 19 reveals something crucial. He is the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near his sword. Only God could control or destroy this magnificent creature. Then God described an even more fearsome creature, Leviathan. Job chapter 41 verse 1 poses the challenge. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook or press down his tongue with a cord? This sea monster was beyond human ability to capture or control. Job chapter 41 verses 18 and 19 paint a terrifying picture. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches, sparks of fire leap forth. This creature breathed fire and light, more like a dragon than any ordinary animal. Job chapter 41 verse 33 concludes the description. On earth there is not his like, a creature without fear. Leviathan was the ultimate apex predator, afraid of nothing and controlled by no one except its creator. The point of these descriptions was clear. If Job couldn't control or even understand these creatures, how could he presume to judge their creator's actions? The second divine speech had its intended effect. Job finally understood not just his limitations, but his proper relationship to God. His second response was completely different from his first. Instead of just acknowledging his smallness, he experienced a fundamental transformation of heart. Job chapter 42 verses 1 and 2 begin his final speech. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Job's theology had been corrected. He now understood that God's power was absolute and his purposes were unstoppable. This wasn't the grudging admission of someone who had been overpowered. It was the joyful recognition of someone who had finally seen truth clearly. Job chapter 42 verse 3 shows his recognition of his previous ignorance. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Job quoted God's earlier question back to him, acknowledging that he had been speaking about things beyond his comprehension. He had been like someone trying to explain poetry in a language they didn't speak. The word wonderful here doesn't just mean good. It means miraculous, beyond ordinary understanding. Job realized that God's ways were not just different from human ways. They were transcendently superior. Job chapter 42 verse 4 continues his acknowledgement. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. He repeated God's challenge, showing that he now understood the proper order of their relationship. God was the teacher, Job was the student. God asked the questions, Job provided what answers he could. Then came the crucial turning point. Job chapter 42 verse 5 reveals his transformation. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Job's previous knowledge of God had been second-hand, stories passed down, traditions inherited, theological concepts learned, but now he had experienced God directly, personally, immediately. This wasn't just intellectual knowledge anymore, it was intimate, experiential knowledge. The difference was like reading about love versus falling in love, or studying music versus hearing a symphony. Finally came Job's complete surrender. Job chapter 42 verse 6 records his ultimate response. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. The word despise here means to reject or recant his previous position. He wasn't hating himself as a person, he was rejecting his previous attitude toward God. The repentance wasn't for specific sins that had caused his suffering, but for his presumption in challenging God's wisdom and justice. Dust and ashes was the ultimate expression of humility, acknowledging his mortality and insignificance compared to the eternal Creator. With Job's heart properly aligned, God turned his attention to the three friends who had spent so many chapters accusing Job of hidden sins. Their theology had been even more flawed than Job's questions, and now they would face divine correction. Job chapter 42 verse 7 contains God's judgment. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, My anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. This statement was shocking. Despite all of Job's complaints and questions, God called him my servant and said he had spoken rightly. The friends who thought they were defending God's honor had actually misrepresented his character. Their simplistic theology that automatically equated suffering with sin had been completely wrong. God's anger wasn't just disapproval. It was the righteous wrath of the Creator against those who had distorted his nature and added to the suffering of an innocent man. Job chapter 42 verse 8 reveals God's requirement for forgiveness. Now therefore, take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves. And my servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept his prayer not to deal with you according to your folly. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. The friends had to humble themselves in multiple ways. First, they had to provide expensive sacrifices. 7 bulls and 7 rams represented significant financial cost. Second, they had to go to the man they had accused and ask him to intercede for them. This must have been deeply humbling for these proud, successful men who had been so confident in their theological understanding. Third, they had to acknowledge that Job, whom they had accused of sin, was actually more righteous than they were. The fact that God would only accept Job's prayer for them proved that Job had been right all along about his integrity. This whole scene revealed something beautiful about God's justice. He didn't just vindicate Job privately, he did it publicly, requiring the friends to acknowledge their error. But he also provided a way for their relationship to be restored. The sacrifice would atone for their sin, and Job's intercession would heal the breach between them. Job chapter 42 verse 9 records their obedience. So Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did what the Lord had told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. The friends swallowed their pride and did exactly what God commanded. Job, despite all the pain they had caused him with their accusations, willingly prayed for their forgiveness. This showed the depth of Job's transformation. He harbored no bitterness toward those who had wronged him. Once Job's heart was right with God and his relationships with his friends were restored, the final phase of his story began. God's justice demanded not just vindication, but restoration. Job chapter 42 verse 10 marks the turning point, and the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. The timing was significant. Restoration came after Job had interceded for those who had wronged him. This wasn't just about personal blessing, but about complete reconciliation and healing of all relationships. The doubling of his possessions wasn't arbitrary. It was a demonstration that God's rewards are always greater than his trials. Job chapter 42 verse 11 describes the first sign of restoration. Then came to him all his brothers and sisters and all who had known him before, and ate bread with him in his house. And they showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him, and every one of them gave him a piece of money and a ring of gold. The same relatives and friends who had avoided him during his suffering now returned to celebrate his restoration. Their gifts of money and gold rings weren't just tokens, they were significant contributions to rebuilding his wealth. This showed that Job's restoration wasn't just supernatural, but also involved the generosity and support of his community. The phrase, "all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him," is important. It acknowledges that ultimately God was sovereign over both the suffering and the restoration. Job chapter 42 verse 12 lists his new possessions. And the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. And he had 14,000 sheep, 7,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. Every category of his wealth was exactly doubled from what he had lost. He had started with 7,000 sheep and now had 14,000. His 3,000 camels became 6,000. His 500 yoke of oxen became 1,000. His 500 female donkeys became 1,000. This wasn't just random blessing, it was precise, intentional restoration that proved God's complete control over material circumstances. The doubling also demonstrated that the trial had been temporary, but the blessing would be permanent. Job's patience and faithfulness during his suffering had earned him rewards that far exceeded his original prosperity. His latter days were blessed more than his beginning, showing that God's ultimate purpose was always blessing, not punishment. The restoration also vindicated God's original confidence in Job's character. Satan had claimed that Job only served God for material benefits, but Job had maintained his faith even when everything was taken away. Now that his faith had been proven genuine, God could restore his material blessings without anyone questioning Job's motives. The final aspect of Job's restoration involved something that couldn't simply be doubled: his family. Children aren't possessions that can be replaced with exact duplicates, and the restoration of Job's family life required special grace and healing. Job chapter 42 verse 13 announces this blessing. He had also 7 sons and 3 daughters, the same number of children as before, because each child is precious and irreplaceable. God didn't give Job more children than he had lost. He gave him the same number, acknowledging that the original children couldn't simply be mathematically replaced, but the new children brought their own special blessings. Job chapter 42 verse 14 introduces them. And he called the name of the first Jemimah, and the name of the second Keziah, and the name of the third Keren-Happuch. The names were significant. Jemimah means dove, symbolizing peace after the storm. Keziah means cassia, a precious spice, indicating sweetness after bitterness. Keren-Happuch means horn of cosmetics, suggesting beauty after ugliness. These names reflected Job's recognition that God had brought beauty out of ashes, peace out of turmoil, and sweetness out of suffering. Job chapter 42 verse 15 reveals something unusual about these daughters. And in all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. In ancient times, daughters rarely received inheritances, but Job's experience had taught him to value every blessing God gave him. His daughters weren't just beautiful. They were treated with unusual honor and given security for their future. This showed how Job's suffering had changed his perspective on what was truly valuable. The final verse of the book summarizes Job's blessed conclusion. Job chapter 42 verses 16 and 17 record his peaceful end. And after this, Job lived 140 years and saw his sons and his sons' sons, 4 generations. And Job died an old man and full of days. Job lived long enough to see his great-great-grandchildren experiencing the joy of a large, thriving family. The phrase, full of days, doesn't just mean old. It means satisfied, complete, having experienced the fullness of life's blessings. Job died peacefully, surrounded by family, wealthy, honored, and at peace with God. His story had come full circle, from blessing to trial to greater blessing. The man who had once wished he had never been born now died completely satisfied with the life God had given him. His patience had been rewarded, his faith had been vindicated, and his example had been preserved for future generations who would face their own trials and need encouragement that God's purposes are always ultimately good. If this video has encouraged your faith or opened your eyes to new insights about suffering and God's sovereignty, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our biblical storytelling videos. Your subscription helps us reach more people with these powerful truths that can transform lives. Don't keep these secrets to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to hear Job's message of hope. Whether they're facing their own trials or simply seeking to understand God's ways better, Job's story can be the encouragement they desperately need. What spoke to your heart most in Job's journey? Drop a comment below and let us know which part of his story resonated with you. We love hearing how God's word impacts your life, and your testimony might be exactly what another viewer needs to read today. Until next time, remember, just like Job, your story isn't over. God is writing something beautiful through your trials, and his final chapter will always be restoration and blessing.